Hi, I'm Caroline.
And I'm Adrienne.
And this is Scandal Sheets. Hello and welcome to Scandal Sheets, the podcast that explores the scandals of history along with the people and places associated with it. I am your host, Caroline.
And I'm your host, Adrienne.
And yay for part 2 of Louis Kahn. We finally got around to doing it.
Been a while. Mostly my fault.
Well. Life gets in the way sometimes. Right now, this lovely Allagash triple is getting in the way.
Uh-huh. Yep. It's really tasty.
It is very tasty, actually. I have
It's a good one.
excellent choosing abilities.
Yeah. I like coming up with names of cocktails to associate with our podcast. But if we don't have a bartender, I'm cool with drinking fancy beer. Because I feel like someone should serve us.
Right? I do agree with that.
Okay.
So, if you're a hot guy and you're listening to this podcast, please feel free to apply to be our bartender. We'll provide the booze.
Mm-hmm.
Anywho, we are running low on a laptop battery, and of course, in standard Caroline fashion, I forgot the charger, so we're going to just dive on in tonight.
Yep.
As a quick recap, our last episode, which you need to go listen to if you have not already, started out the story of Louis Kahn, who's considered one of the great modern architects, and I guess as a quick sum up, he really didn't get started as a well-known architect until his like 40s, 50s.
Yeah. Yes.
I think it probably had to do with the fact that he was juggling a lot of women. As
Probably had something to do with it.
We have seen with a lot of the subjects in our this podcast. Not only was he married, he had a long-term affair with one of his colleagues, and that affair resulted in a child. Right. So that's kind of where we left it, with his relationship with Anne Ting, who was his mistress, and then of course his marriage to Esther Kahn.
Yep.
They also had a daughter as well. So one wife, one mistress, 2 kids. That pretty much sums it up.
Were there just 2 kids? Nathaniel?
At this point, yeah.
I was like,
you always have to jump ahead. You have less patience than I do, and I didn't think that was possible. We'll just go ahead and jump on in.
Okay.
So in 1958, or maybe the year prior to that, Louis Kahn cut ties with his long-term mistress Anne Ting, only to fall in love with another protege. He met Harriet Pattinson in 1958 through fellow architect Robert Venturi. Louis was 58 at the time, and Harriet was 31. Harriet was born into a large family in Chicago around 1927. I couldn't find an exact date. I based that estimate on an interview where she states that she visited the Century of Progress exposition in Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
In 1933.
Cool.
She was 5 years old at the time. So.
Okay.
That's how I came up with that. Her family was solidly middle class. Her father owned an apartment building in which they lived in. She attended the Francis Parker School, which was an independent school in Chicago. And she went on to study at Wellesley College like her mother and sister. But she did not enjoy it, and so she quit. Now, after a break, she finished her studies at the University of Chicago. She was interested in acting at first.
Oh.
And she fell in with the Compass Players, which were actually the precursor to the Second City Theater.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
that's really cool.
I know, right? She went on to study acting and theater at Yale, so I'm assuming that it was like a post-grad type of situation.
Oh, and that's where he was.
Right. While she was studying acting at Yale, she ended up shifting into just plain art. And that was when she met Louis Kahn. But at the time, she didn't know who he was.
Right.
They actually picked him up.
That's funny.
One day while they were en route to a local cafeteria and saw him slipping around in the snow. So they gave him a lift, and of course, he was working on the Yale Art Gallery at this time. So That was why he was in town.
That's another cool building.
And they ended up having lunch together, but she never got his name. the 50s and the 60s, where you just pick up random people on the street and don't get their name. But she wrote in her diary at the time that she had met a great man, and that the conversation that she had with him affected her quite a lot. So they met again for the first time at this party in 1958 and soon fell into an affair. Now, they ended up working together because she was a landscape architect by this time. And it took a couple years, but in early 1962, Harriet turned up pregnant. Her family was horrified. In fact, her two brothers hated Lou and refused to even mention his name. And they were pressuring her to get an abortion. Her sister Edwina tried to organize a wedding so that the baby could be somewhat legitimate, but that's a problem because Lou's married.
Yeah.
Actually, no, I take that back. Her sister was trying to marry her off to just some random guy, basically. So the baby...
so she would have a child.
Right.
Would they not tell him then that she was pregnant?
I think they found a guy and they basically told him that she was pregnant and that he was going to be the stand-in, so to speak. But Harriet refused to do that. So she ended up disappearing to Maine and stayed with some close friends until she had the baby.
Wait, did Kahn know?
Yes, he did. And I think we discussed this quite a lot in the last episode, but I'm basing a lot of my stuff off of the documentary that Kahn's son Nathaniel directed and produced. And I think when he was interviewing Harriet, who was his mother, she said that when she told Lou, he was like, "Oh, not again." So he didn't really seem like the type of person who was really aware. Sometimes he just seemed to be like so caught up in his work and in his mental processes that it was like it never really occurred to him that he might get his mistress pregnant. So
Harriet is Nathaniel's mom.
Correct. So yes, Nathaniel was born in November of 1962. And the couple that she had been living with at the time actually offered to adopt him, but she chose to just live her life as a single mother, which, of course, would have been incredibly difficult in 1962. Kahn and Harriet would go on to collaborate on one of Kahn's greatest buildings, which was the Kimball Art Museum in, is it Dallas?
Yeah. Fort Worth.
Fort Worth, okay. They're all the same, right? Going back to that horrible geography thing, Harriet designed the landscape, but their professional and private lives did not always run smoothly. Reportedly, Kahn got angry by something Harriet did or said just before the opening of the Kimball, so he had her removed from the guest list. So she wasn't even able to attend the grand opening of a project that she helped design.
That doesn't seem like something that he didn't seem like a very spiteful person.
No, he didn't, but yeah, that's just one of those things that came out of I think out of the documentary. She would often not know where Kahn was, and so she would have to pump his secretary for information. And they actually interviewed her in the documentary as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, talking about how she was sort of kind of covering for him all the time. And
she was paid well.
Right, exactly. Well, yeah, we can pretty much guess, being a secretary in the 1960s. So Nathaniel in the documentary says that Kahn would visit him and his mother once a week, often with little notice. He says that his mother would whip up a restaurant-quality meal and Kahn would eat and drink chilled martinis. And since Kahn's visit was special, Nathaniel says that he was allowed to stay up late. And then around 1 or 2 in the morning, he would be packed into the back seat of the car, and his mother would drive Kahn home to his wife Esther, though she would drop him off a block or so down the street so he could walk there.
No way.
So the ironic thing is that Kahn's families all lived within miles of each other. And so, I mean, he was basically visiting Anne and his daughter.
They didn't know about each other.
I think
there was something in the documentary about them not knowing.
They did eventually, I think.
Okay.
And I mean, I'm pretty sure that probably the two mistresses did, because I mean, they both worked with him.
Sure.
And I'm sure, it would. Yeah, so I think she probably knew something was was up.
Yeah.
But maybe didn't let on.
I can't believe that Harriet would just be so giving and welcoming and hospitable and just let him in and cook for him and I mean, I don't know if she was doing it for Nathaniel or, I mean, I guess she loved Lou, but still, like, man, that's just such an odd circumstance.
I think she, unfortunately, was somewhat deluded all the way up to the end, because they said that when, you know, they found him dead in the restroom at Penn Station, that they found his passport and that he had struck out his address.
Yes.
And she thought that was an indication that he intended to leave Esther and marry, you know, come live with them. So, and I believe she even, you know, reiterated that in the documentary. Mm-hmm. So it's something that she's kind of clung to. So, lest you think Kahn was a complete monster.
I didn't think that.
No, I don't think he was. I think he was deeply conflicted.
Yeah.
And he just didn't know how to deal with the fact that he had basically fallen in love with multiple women and had children by them.
Yeah.
And I mean, he clearly loved them when he was with them. And, you know, actually, it was Nathaniel discusses a lot about his relationship with Kahn. And it was it wasn't distant, but, you know, he's your typical 1960s father-son relationship, I feel.
Yeah.
But he showed in the documentary this little flip book that he and his father created called The Book of Silly Boats. Mm-hmm. And it was a bunch of little drawings that Kahn had drawn for him. Mm-hmm. And then as we I don't know if we kind of started briefly touching on this in the last episode, Kahn was beginning to travel a lot all over the world. He would always send Nathaniel postcards. Mm. And one that he sent to Nathaniel while he was working in Bangladesh, it's actually quite sad. It says, "Dearest boy of mine, the architecture here seems like gingerbread bakery to us. To the people of the East, it's an expression of delight. I think of you always, and with all my love, Daddy. P.S. Your father does not feel much like a conquering hero. Someday I hope to be able to teach you to be a better man than I."
Oh,
I know. I was like,
beautiful.
Yeah, and I was just in heartbreaking all at the same time. I was just like,
and he must have been a very young child. I mean, he wouldn't have understood the depth of those sentiments when he read that postcard. Because if he was born in 1962, that's when Kahn was working on the assembly building in Bangladesh that I discussed. But so Nathaniel, I mean, his mother would have been the one that would have read that.
Right.
And, you know, so I'm sure that Kahn really, I mean, I'm sure he knew that Nathaniel one day would read it and understand, but I'm sure at the time that it was addressed to the son, but it was meant for the mother.
Right. So we get to your part, Adrienne. Mm-hmm. In 1962, Kahn was hired by the Bangladeshi government to build a new government complex. So tell us all about that.
The Parliament building is considered Louis Kahn's masterpiece, and it was his last work that he never got to see complete. It's the Capitol and Parliamentary building in Dhaka, Bangladesh, which took 23 years to build, which is the same amount of time as it took to build the Taj Mahal. The work was all done by hand by thousands of workers carrying baskets of concrete up bamboo scaffolding. And there are photographs of this historic black and white photographs. And
so that's the 60s. So it's pretty amazing that they're almost using the same techniques that you would have seen centuries before.
Exactly. Nathaniel Kahn offers this tidbit regarding the structure in the documentary, that during Bangladesh's war for independence from Pakistan in 1971, the enemy pilots did not bomb the building because they thought it was an ancient ruin. Shamsul Waras, Bangladeshi architect, spoke to Nathaniel in the documentary. Lou was invited to create something of enormous significance for the developing country, and the weight of his responsibility was not lost on him. Waras says of Kahn, "He gave us democracy." Wendy Lesser points this out in her book as well, the book that I quoted some passages from last time, that's called You Say